Chapter 23, Mark Lewin and Don Jardine. During my time in Georgia, I received some really great booking advice from Bobby Bruns. He was one of the founding members of the National Wrestling Alliance, and was the booker for St. Louis at the time. He came into Georgia for a week and we really got to know each other well. One evening, he told me, "Kid, the only power you have as a booker is in the people that you hire. Bring in proven commodities, and guys that have drawn money with you, your ideas, and your psychology in the past. Remember, you're only as good as the crew that you have with you." Over the years he had surrounded himself with guys like Dick the Bruiser, Bill Longston, Luthez, Rip Hawk, Bob Ellis, Sonny Myers, and Fritz von Erich, so I knew he practiced what he preached. He gave me great advice, and with that in mind I brought in two proven wrestlers who I drew a lot of money with in the past, Mark Lewin and then the Spoiler. I brought the Spoiler in during September 1975 to challenge for Mr. Wrestling 2's Georgia heavyweight title. Mr. Wrestling 2 was a gigantic box office attraction in Georgia, and truly a legendary figure of Southern wrestling, much like Bruno Sammartino in New York, Fritz von Erich in Dallas, and Dusty Rhodes in Florida. Mr. Wrestling 2 was far better and much more over than the first Mr. Wrestling Tim Woods ever dreamed of being, plus he was the Georgia heavyweight champion. At the time, wearing a state belt such as the Missouri title, Texas title, and Florida title had great meaning. To start off his program with a Spoiler, I put the Spoiler's mask on the line against Mr. Wrestling 2's belt. After a tremendous build-up, Spoiler won the title. I then began the build for the return match, which was the Spoiler's title against Mr. Wrestling 2's mask. To the delight of the fans, Mr. Wrestling 2 regained the title, then booked a 60-minute mask versus mask match in Atlanta, wherein the title wouldn't be on the line, but the loser was to unmask. Mr. Wrestling 2 and the Spoiler wrestled for 60 minutes straight, and put on an unbelievably exciting match. After the time limit expired, Mr. Wrestling 2 challenged the Spoiler to continue, and although the Spoiler wanted to, I wouldn't allow him to. Since the stipulation was that whoever lost had to unmask, and there was no loser, neither of them unmasked. Booking a finish like that is something that few matchmakers would have the balls to do. It wasn't a bait and switch, because it was never advertised that there had to be a winner, and I'm not being glib when I say that. We also didn't jab the people, because believe me when I tell you, they saw a thrilling 60-minute match, and were very satisfied when they left the arena that night. The finish didn't hurt the Spoilers or Mr. Wrestling 2's credibility, either. If anything, it only made the two of them more legendary in the fans' eyes since they both wanted to continue, but I prevented it. Most importantly, the finish didn't hurt the town, because their feud did tremendous business in Atlanta, and all throughout Georgia, for the next 3 months. Actually, the Mr. Wrestling 2 versus the Spoiler feud was one of the best businesses I ever did for a singles run. I'm very proud that I pulled that particular finish off. It wasn't easy to do, it had to be done just right, and I took it very seriously. Mark Lewin came into Georgia as a babyface in December 1975. He was a master of the sleeper, and knew how to do it legit. On certain nights he would go out to the ring, hold his hand out to the audience and declare, "If you hurt, come to me, and I'll make you feel better." He would then pick 3 fans out of the audience and bring them into the ring. He would talk to them, hold their hand, ask them if they had any medical problems or if they were taking medication, check their pulse, and then put them to sleep for an instant. After about 9 seconds, he would wake them up and Freddie Miller would be standing there with a microphone ready to get their reaction when they awoke. Their first comment would sometimes include profanity, because they were coming out of a sleep and just saying the first thing that came to their mind. I remember one time in Columbus, Georgia, a long-haired hippie guy woke up and marveled, "Oh, what a trip that was." Don Jardine, Mark Lewin, and I were thrilled to be together in Georgia. We were best of friends, we all got along great, and we made a lot of money together. A lot of people assume that wrestlers are a bunch of backstabbers and liars looking to screw everyone around them, and while some of them are, I made sure to surround myself with different types of guys. Mark and Don were my friends, and they were very protective of me. After the plane crash I backed off from wrestling on a regular basis and stopped taking bumps like I had in the past. Anytime anyone tried to touch me, Mark and Don would yell, "Hey, watch it. That guy just survived a plane crash." Even though I was the booker, I like to consider myself more of a leader than a boss. As much as I admired Bill Watts, I never wanted to be that type of booker. That wasn't me. Bookers like Bill Watts and Ole Anderson were aggressive guys, but I wasn't. I was more laid back and mellow, and figured I could get more from my crew if I picked the right ones and got them to trust my judgment. I saw myself as a fatherly, Uncle Gary type of booker. I knew I was the boss and the boys knew I was the boss. So why should I try to act like the boss? It would seem a bit silly. Besides, I really admired my boss Jim Barnett's management style. He was never domineering or wanting to be in charge all the time, so I guess I adopted the top-down management style and treated my crew the same way Jim treated me, with respect. One of the greatest compliments I ever received was from Pat O'Connor. He came to Georgia for a week, and as I was taking him back to the airport, he commented, "You know, if I didn't know for a fact you were the booker, I never would have guessed it. You seem like one of the boys." I was grinning ear to ear as I replied, "That's what I try to be." At the same time, Tom Renisto had to point out to me, "You're not one of the boys anymore. You're the boss." That was a very hard transition for me, and it took me some time to learn how to walk that fine line. At times, Mark and Don would assume they could do anything they wanted because their buddy Gary was the booker, and I would have to remind them that, friendship aside, I had to do what's right for business. They understood that, and respected me for it. Even though I was their friend 24/7, I still had responsibilities to the office, and had to run the company and keep it profitable. That way, in the end, we could all make more money. I never lost sight of that. It wasn't about fame or glory to me, it was about how much money me and my crew will have at the end of the week to feed our families and buy the stuff that makes us happy. That's what I was there for. As Mark would say, when you can make money with your friends, that's the best kind of money there is. Over time, I learned how to be the boss when I had to be. For instance, I would put my foot down whenever Don and Mark wanted to discuss what went on in the office, and I would tell them that what happens in the office stays in the office. I was good at keeping things private, and never had a need to let on that I was in the know. I was smart enough to know that if I were to tell Mark and Don all the dirt, that would only add to rumor, innuendo, and fodder. And cause trouble. If I were to mention, for instance, that I was thinking of putting the tag titles on Bob Orton and Dick Slater, everyone would question why I was doing that. I subscribed to the need-to-know basis. If I needed to tell you something, I would tell you. Also, if I said things that didn't happen, I would lose my credibility. I always wanted to maintain my credibility so that when I told someone something, they knew it would happen. Abdullah the Butcher was also on my crew. I had known Abdullah since 1963, when he was wrestling under his real name, Larry Shreve. Back then, he had a karate gimmick, and believe it or not, he was quite good at karate. With the spoiler, Mark Lewin, Abdullah the Butcher, and the tag team of Dick Slater and Bob Orton, I had 4 layers of content, and was really stacking the cards. I learned that from Jim Barnett and Bill Watts, to load up the undercards to get the most business as possible. I love Abdullah to death, but booking him was never easy. For starters, he didn't like to lose. One time I had to get pretty creative, and sneaky, to get him to do the right thing. After he had a good run with Jerry Briscoe, I booked Abby in a hot program with Mark Lewin, and it was imperative that Mark went over to finish it off. I told Abby I was booking him and Mark in a 2/3 falls match, where Mark would put him to sleep for the first fall, and then told him that he could use a fork during the second fall. Using a fork on his opponent is Abby's favorite thing to do, and he uses in every one of his matches, so he was thrilled. Then, I told Abby that just before the 3rd fall, he would attack Mark with a fork again, and since Mark wouldn't be able to continue, the match would be over. Butchie just loved that, and he really wanted to tear the place apart. The night of the match, we went to the ring and the first fall went 7 minutes. Mark put the sleeper on, and Abdullah fell asleep. Then, I went in the ring and worked Abdullah's back and neck, popped him, and woke him up. Butchie turned around and noticed that Mark had gone back to the dressing room. He looked at me confused and asked, "Where's Mark?" "You're the Mark," I replied. "He's gone back to the dressing room." This was a 1-fall match. After his feud with Abdullah, Mark Lewin got involved in a really heated program with the spoiler, and one night in Columbus, Mark asked the referee, Leon Ogle, to get involved in the finish. Leon was the son-in-law of Columbus and Macon promoter Fred Ward, and was actually married to the fat girl that Bill Watts made the comment about that got him fired. Anyways, Leon got so excited about being involved in the finish that he asked to be bladed, and even requested that a scar be left. I started explaining that his involvement wouldn't require getting a scar, but he didn't want to hear it, and insisted on getting one so he could show it off to all his friends. I asked Don not to cut Leon too deep, but when the time came during the match, Don accidentally sliced a vein, and blood was literally shooting out of Leon's forehead. Leon, that goofy nut, loved it, even though he had to be rushed to the hospital. Fred Ward wasn't so happy, however, and demanded to know why Leon was cut up so badly and had to be sent to the hospital. I tried explaining that Leon wanted a scar so he could strut all over town with it and show it off, but it was of no use, and from that moment on, Fred Ward had it in for me, big time. About a week later, Jim called me into his office and told me that he had just received a phone call from Ralph Freed. Ralph was another son-in-law of Fred's, and he served as Fred's right-hand man. Ralph had apparently told Jim that he saw Dick Slater and Bob Orton smoking marijuana in the back of the Columbus Coliseum after the matches the previous night. I told Jim that there was no way Ralph saw Bob or Dick smoking marijuana behind the Coliseum after the matches, because I was with them after the matches and we went right out to the car and left. Jim was relieved to hear what I said, but felt that we should all sit down and talk about it, because Fred Ward was very upset over this accusation. The following week, we went to Columbus for the next show, and all 6 of us sat down: Bob Orton, Dick Slater, Jim Barnett, Fred Ward, Ralph Freed, and Jim started the meeting off saying, "There seems to be a disconnect." Ralph told me that he saw Dick and Bob in the back of the arena smoking dope after last week's show, but according to Gary, they all left together as soon as the show was over. Fred Ward rolled his eyes and sneered, "I put a lot more stock in Ralph's word than Gary Hart's." Bob was real angry that this was all going on to begin with, and as soon as Fred said that, Bob yelled, "You fat piece of crap. I come from a wrestling family, and if this rumor that you're starting gets back to my dad, I'll kick your ass." The meeting disintegrated from there and was basically over before it started. The accusation was eventually dropped, but Dick, Bob, and I were no longer welcome in Columbus or Macon. Since I was no longer welcome there, Tom Renisto took over booking responsibilities for those towns. Keep in mind that when I was originally hired, it was because promoters like Fred Ward hated Tom so much that they didn't want him near their towns. Now it was at the point where Fred preferred Tom over me. That was bad. Not long after that, Jack Briscoe and Bill Watts came to Georgia for a few shows. While they were there, I asked them to grade me on my first booking experience. They both agreed that on TV production and matchmaking, putting asses in the seats, and developing talent, I got an A+. But on politics, they gave me a lowly F. They were obviously referring to my getting banned from Fred Ward's towns. Bill then added, in all seriousness, "Don't worry. Over time, you'll become as good a politician as I am." This was coming from the successful politician who was fired for insulting Fred Ward's daughter. One day, Jim Barnett called me into his office and told me that he had received a phone call from Ted Turner. Ted told Jim that there was to be no more blood on TCG, under any circumstances. Ted was specifically fed up with Abdullah the Butcher, but what could he expect from Abdullah? Blood is how he establishes himself, blood is how he stays over, and blood is what the fans want from him. I understood Ted's edict, though. Even though wrestling got Ted Turner good ratings, blood brought too many complaints from advertisers, and he didn't want to hear it anymore. When Jim told me of the new rule, I assured him he wouldn't have to worry about a thing. As I mentioned earlier, Mark Lewin and the Spoiler were involved in a great program. In my day, we called a good, long feud a program. Today it's called a storyline. Whatever you want to call it is fine by me, but I was building up to a sleeper versus claw match between them, and wanted to do something big on TV to really hype their upcoming match at the Omni. When Mark, Don, and I were coming up with a great angle to air on TCG, I made it clear that there was to be no blood, and that if somebody bled the hard way, TCG producers would censor it and cover up the blood. Don immediately complained, "Well, with my claw there has to be blood." "Don't be like that," I said to Don. "There hasn't been blood every time you've used the claw." Mark then questioned, "Since when do we let TV people tell us how to run our business?" It was difficult winning them over, but I assured them that this angle would get over phenomenally without any blood, and they finally agreed to do the angle without blading. The day we shot the angle for TCG, I took Professor Tanaka, a martial arts expert, into the ring with me. Tanaka was going to carefully observe Mark Lewin applying the sleeper hold on me in an attempt to prove that Mark's sleeper hold was nothing more than a choke. However, as I turned around for Mark to put the sleeper on me, Tanaka whacked him with a judo chop to the back of his neck, and Mark went down. At that point, the Spoiler rolled under the bottom rope and put the claw on Mark. So far, the angle was going smoothly and without a hitch. Unbeknownst to me, however, Don, Mark, and Tanaka got together and came up with a way to beat the system and use blood. Here's where the angle we set up took a left turn, and I'll explain it to you exactly as I witnessed it. After the Spoiler released the claw and backed away, Mark sat straight up, faced the camera, and had blood pouring down his face. Even though I was stunned, I noticed that Tanaka, who was supposed to be in the ring fending off anyone who would try and save Mark, was standing over by Gordon Soley, watching the monitor. Suddenly, Tanaka rolled into the ring and ripped off Mark's pants, leaving him in his underwear. By that time, I had lost complete control, and just walked away and left them by themselves. They had set me up, and I was so mad that you couldn't even possibly imagine how I felt. They completely went into business for themselves, did whatever they wanted to do, and were determined to get their angle over at any expense. They wanted to get the biggest ratings, draw the largest houses, make the most money, and be the kings of Georgia Championship Wrestling. That's fine and all, but when the blood came, I was disgusted with both of them. When I got to the dressing room, Tom Renisto was shaking his head in disbelief and warned me, "You're going to be in deep trouble. That's some heavy stuff you just pulled out there." I started to explain that I didn't know they would do that, but stopped. Why bother defending myself? I was the booker, and the buck stopped with me. I knew I was going to be fired, so I just went home and watched it on TV that night. As I saw it on TV, I realized what Tanaka was doing over by Gordon Soley. He was watching the monitor to see when the sensors blurred out the blood. As soon as he saw that, he ran in the ring and pulled Mark's pants off, because he knew that the sensors, who were blurring the blood in real time, would switch the joystick from the blood to the underwear, and since there was no editing outtakes or reshoots, there was only one thing that could be blurred, and they would choose to show the blood. Therefore, blood is what I saw on TV, blood is what the audience saw at home, blood is what Jim Barnett saw, and blood is what Ted Turner saw. Jim called me the next day and let me know that Ted Turner personally called him to ask who had produced that show on TCG. When Jim gave him my name, Ted Turner said that he didn't want me to produce anything for TCG or appear on TCG ever again, and that he didn't want the spoiler, Mark Lewin and Professor Tanaka on his station again, either. By then, I was so fed up with Georgia politics and all the nonsense with Fred Ward that I really didn't care that I was fired, and was actually sort of relieved to be let go. When Don and Mark realized that their stunt got me fired, they felt bad, apologized profusely, and offered to tell Jim that I didn't know anything about it. I told them not to bother, because I was the booker and producer, and at the end of the day, I was responsible for the content of the show. I wasn't blind to the fact that two of my best friends had just taken advantage of our friendship. When friends take advantage of my good nature, it's pretty hard to accept. I let it slide, though. I guess deep down I felt that they had helped me so much in my career that if I lost a job over something they did, so what? I took the bump for Don and Mark, but I did it because they were my friends. Now, if it had been someone other than my friends, it would have been a completely different story. My stint as booker in Georgia was a real breakthrough experience for me in wrestling. Most in the business knew me as a manager, as a guy who was good at interviews, and as someone with clever ideas for finishes. After my successful year as booker of Georgia Championship Wrestling, however, people started realizing that I had more to offer, so in that sense, regardless of how it ended, I am forever grateful and proud of